Rome did not disappear. It dimmed. Rome did not end in fire or triumph, but softened into habit as streets stayed familiar. Walls endured, routines persisted, and a city learned quietly that certainty had slipped away, leaving daily life to continue without explanation or urgency tonight. Many listen quietly here, night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive. Now, rest. A city still standing without a center. After the fall, Rome remained physically immense but psychologically scattered. A city whose stone still held shape while its sense of coordination quietly dissolved. The walls did not crumble and the streets did not forget their roots, yet the rhythm that once synchronized movement, authority, and expectation had thinned into something local and uneven. People woke inside structures designed for empire while living lives that no longer extended beyond the next familiar corner, and this mismatch shaped every ordinary hour that followed. Forums stood intact, yet unused. Their scale no longer matched the conversations of those who passed them. Roads still radiated outward, with confidence built into their angles, but fewer travelers arrived with reasons that felt connected to anything larger than survival. The city had not lost its body, it had lost its pulse. Rome became a place of neighborhoods, rather than a unified organism, and daily life adjusted without announcement, the way posture adjusts when weight shifts unexpectedly. Life moved inward by necessity rather than ideology. What mattered was no longer what connected Rome to distant provinces or imperial memory, but what connected one household to the next. Familiar faces replaced abstract authority. Proximity replaced scale. People learned the value of knowing who lived behind each door more than knowing who claimed power beyond the walls. The empire had taught Rome to think outward. Its absence taught Rome to think close. There was no ceremony marking this change. It emerged gradually through behavior. Markets shrank in scope, trade routes shortened, goods circulated within smaller loops. A loaf of bread mattered more than a decree. Water access mattered more than title. The city still functioned, but it did so in fragments, each fragment sustaining itself without requiring agreement from the others. Public spaces softened rather than emptied. They remained available but no longer commanding. Basilicas echoed less with purpose and more with absence. Administrative buildings continued to stand, but their authority felt borrowed from memory rather than enforced by presence. People passed through these spaces with caution, not fear, adjusting their expectations downward without discussing it aloud. Rome's scale became a quiet inconvenience. Large structures demanded maintenance without providing reassurance. Marble columns required care even when symbolism no longer paid dividends. The city learned to reuse rather than restore, to adapt rather than preserve. Grandeur faded into background, useful only when it could shelter or store. Utility replaced display, not through reform, but through fatigue. Neighborhoods gained importance because they required less coordination. Local agreements replaced universal ones. Informal cooperation solved problems that official systems no longer addressed reliably. Trust narrowed but deepened. People learned which routes were safest, which wells still flowed, which homes shared resources without question. The city became legible again at human scale. There is quiet irony in how functional this was. Rome survived not by reclaiming unity, but by releasing it. Centralization had become expensive. Fragmentation conserved energy. Smaller systems adapted faster, repaired quicker, and demanded less belief. The city did not mourn its lost center. It worked around it. Streets that once served empire now served familiarity. Movement followed memory rather than instruction. People walked routes they trusted, not routes that impressed. The city shrank psychologically without shrinking physically, and this reduction made daily life manageable again. Late-night history lingers here because this version of Rome feels honest. A city still standing without a center reveals how endurance often depends on letting go of coordination before collapse forces it. Rome did not disappear, it redistributed itself into quieter patterns, and those patterns carried life forward without explanation. Markets that shrank without disappearing. Large markets no longer dominated daily exchange, yet trade did not vanish from Rome after the fall. It did not collapse dramatically, nor did it announce its survival with confidence. Instead, it softened, it contracted. It quietly reorganized itself into a shape that matched diminished certainty. Where wide plazas had once gathered dense crowds and ambitious variety, smaller clusters now appeared without ceremony. A few baskets placed on stone, a table borrowed for an afternoon, familiar faces returning at predictable hours. Commerce continued without spectacle, no longer attempting to prove abundance or reassure anyone about prosperity. It existed because people still needed to eat, to repair, and to exchange what remained useful. These smaller markets did not declare themselves as replacements for what had been lost. No one gathered to explain the transition. There were no speeches, no announcements, no plans outlining the future of trade. They emerged naturally, filling the empty spaces left behind when centralized systems became unreliable. People noticed outcomes rather than causes. Bread could still be found if one knew where to look. Vegetables appeared at the same corners on certain days. Cloth and tools moved between hands that recognized one another. Trust replaced scale. Recognition replaced regulation. Markets became personal rather than monumental. The change did not feel ideological. It felt practical. Goods narrowed in scope without drama. Items chosen for necessity replaced items chosen for display. Bread mattered because hunger persisted. Oil mattered because lamps still burned. Cloth mattered because clothing wore down regardless of political clarity. Variety felt unnecessary when replacement could not be guaranteed. This was not yet poverty. It was restraint learned quickly and applied evenly. Restraint conserved energy. It reduced disappointment. Both mattered more than choice. Vendors adapted without instruction. Those who once depended on long supply chains adjusted to shorter ones. Goods sourced nearby became dominant, not because they were preferred, but because they were reachable. Items that required coordination across distance faded quietly from stalls without being mourned. No one demanded them loudly. Desire softened when expectation followed. The city learned to want what could be reliably obtained rather than what once symbolized success. Money continued to circulate, though unevenly and without confidence. Coin mattered where trust extended far enough to accept it. Barter returned where familiarity made accounting unnecessary. Exchange became flexible, a loaf for a favor, oil for repair, a promise remembered rather than recorded. Transactions were smaller and slower, but they remained steady. Steadiness replaced growth as the measure of success. A market that persisted mattered more than one that expanded. There is mild irony in how calm this adjustment appeared. Rome had once engineered markets as displays of coordination and control. After the fall, markets demonstrated something quieter. Adaptability without permission. They did not require oversight to function. They required only repeated interaction. This repetition stabilized daily life more effectively than any proclamation could have. Systems shrank, but habits held. Public market spaces did not empty entirely. They changed character. Large areas hosted fewer stalls. Gaps appeared between sellers. These gaps were not signs of failure. They allowed movement. They reduced competition. Sellers did not shout. Buyers did not linger. Exchange happened efficiently and then dispersed. The atmosphere felt restrained rather than desperate. Desperation seeks volume. Restraint seeks sufficiency. Prices fluctuated without consistent logic. This inconsistency did not provoke panic. People adjusted expectations rather than demanding fairness. Fairness requires enforcement. Enforcement requires authority. Authority had thinned. Negotiation replaced regulation. Agreements formed locally and dissolved quietly when conditions changed. This flexibility prevented rigidity from breaking fragile systems. What could bend survived. Markets also shifted in time as well as space. Some operated only at certain hours. Others appeared irregularly. Predictability became localized rather than universal. People learned patterns through observation rather than announcement. Knowledge spread through repetition rather than explanation. Knowing when and where mattered more than knowing why. Explanation had become optional. The social tone of markets changed as well. Status mattered less when luxury receded. Skill gained value. Those who could repair tools or preserve food traded reliably. Practical knowledge became a form of currency. This did not eliminate inequality, but it altered its expression. Power moved from accumulation to usefulness. Being needed mattered more than being impressive. There is understated humor in how quickly markets shed pretense. Without empire to perform for, trade stopped pretending to be grand. It became functional again. This functionality felt almost restorative. Less noise, less waste, fewer promises. The market no longer asked to be admired. It asked only to be used. Late-night history lingers here because these markets reveal endurance in its most ordinary form. They did not resist change. They absorbed it. They shrank without disappearing. And in shrinking, they made daily life possible again. One transaction at a time. Without spectacle, without certainty, and without needing to explain themselves. Monuments that became background. The great structures of Rome did not collapse all at once. They did not crumble on cue or vanish with the authority that once commissioned them. Instead, they remained where they had always been, heavy and unmoving, while instruction quietly left them behind. Temples, basilicas, bath complexes, arches, and civic halls continued to occupy space, but daily life began to flow around them rather than toward them. Stone endured. Attention moved on. In the years after central power weakened, monuments lost their schedules. They were no longer destinations with fixed purposes or regulated rituals. Doors stood open or closed, without announcement. Courtyards filled with shadow rather than crowds. The buildings did not resist this change. They accepted it with the indifference only stone can manage. Grandeur does not need approval to persist. It only needs mass. Marble that once demanded admiration became scenery. columns that once framed ceremonies became points of reference. People walked past them without looking up, not out of disrespect, but out of familiarity. When something occupies space long enough, it stops asking to be noticed. It becomes part of the ground rules. Rome learned this slowly. The city discovered that monuments do not require attention in order to continue existing. Some structures found new uses without debate. Steps became seating. Porticos became shelter from rain or sun. Walls became boundaries for temporary markets or quiet conversations. A basilica might host trade in the morning and silence in the afternoon. The change did not feel like reuse. It felt like accommodation. The buildings did not argue. They adapted by remaining still. There is gentle irony in how little effort this transition required. Rome had invested enormous energy into making its monuments impressive. After the fall, they became impressive in a different way. They endured neglect without complaint. Their scale allowed them to survive indifference. Smaller structures faded more quickly. Larger ones lingered simply because removing them required more effort than ignoring them. Public memory tends to associate monuments with purpose. In practice, purpose proved temporary. What remained was presence. The arches still cast shadows. The walls still cooled the air nearby. The stones still held heat after sunset. These physical properties mattered more than symbolic meaning. Daily life adjusted to what the structures continued to offer, rather than what they once represented. People did not gather to mourn the loss of function. They gathered because the space was convenient. A wide platform offered room to sort goods. A covered hall offered shade. A collapsed roof still provided partial enclosure. The monuments did not need to be complete to be useful. Fragmentation did not disqualify them. It merely changed how they were approached. Over time, the city's visual hierarchy flattened. What had once stood apart now blended in. The monumental became background. This shift was not dramatic. It happened gradually through repetition. When a structure is passed every day without incident, it stops signaling importance. It becomes reliable. Reliability is quieter than authority, but often more valuable. There is something almost restful about this phase of Rome's life. Without constant instruction, buildings settled into long-term existence. No banners announced their relevance. No officials enforced their use. They simply stood, offering what they could. Stone does not perform. It waits. Sound behaved differently around these structures as well. Voices echoed briefly and then dissipated. Footsteps softened against worn surfaces. The city grew quieter in certain places, not because fewer people lived there, but because fewer activities demanded amplification. The monuments absorbed noise without returning it. Their mass dampened urgency. Some buildings became landmarks not for what they were, but for where they were. Directions referenced them casually. Meet near the old columns, turn at the large arch, pass the broken wall. These references did not require explanation. Everyone knew which stones were meant. Familiarity replaced reverence. The city did not shrink away from its monuments. It coexisted with them. Life threaded itself through gaps and corners. Children played in courtyards, once reserved for officials. Animals rested in shaded recesses. People stored tools against ancient walls without hesitation. The stone did not object. It had already survived more ambitious intentions. There is understated humor in how permanence outlasted importance. Rome had built to impress eternity. Eternity arrived, but without applause. The monuments remained, but their audience thinned. What survived was not meaning, but mass. Not purpose, but presence. In a way, this was a more honest test. The transformation of monuments into background did not signal decay so much as normalization. The extraordinary became ordinary. This ordinariness allowed the city to continue functioning without ceremony. Life does not require grandeur. It requires space, shelter, and reference points. The monuments provided all three. At night, this change becomes especially clear. Without crowds or official lighting, the structures recede into darkness. Their outlines soften. Their scale becomes ambiguous. They feel less like statements and more like terrain. The city sleeps around them. They do not mind. In late-night history, this is where attention lingers, not on collapse, but on continuation, not on ruin, but on adaptation. Rome did not abandon its monuments, it absorbed them. They became part of the city's background noise visually and emotionally. The monuments did not ask to be remembered differently. They did not insist on relevance. They allowed time to decide how they would be used or ignored. This patience is easy to miss during the day. At night, it becomes obvious. What remains is a city that learned to live with its own past without constantly addressing it. The monuments stayed, life moved, stone waited, and in that waiting, Rome found a quieter way to endure. Officials without salaries. Administrative roles in Rome outlived their compensation. Pay disappeared before titles did. Authority thinned before routine adjusted. Some officials continued working long after salaries stopped arriving, not out of devotion to a vanished state, but because stopping required explanation, and explanation demanded an authority that no longer reliably existed. It was easier to continue than to formally acknowledge the absence of reason. Records were still kept, not meticulously, not with confidence, but with habit. A clerk sharpened his stylus. A ledger was opened. Dates were written carefully, even when their relevance felt uncertain. The action itself mattered more than the outcome. Writing preserved continuity, even when the future no longer appeared guaranteed by what was written. Paper and parchment accumulated quietly, not as promises, but as residue. Orders were still drafted, cautiously phrased, often softened by uncertainty. Language adjusted to reflect diminished enforcement. Words leaned toward suggestion rather than command. Phrases grew careful. Responsibility was implied rather than asserted. The tone shifted without formal announcement. Authority survived as habit long after it ceased to function as power. There is a mild irony in how administration proved more durable than ambition. Armies require funding, construction requires supply, administration requires only repetition. A person accustomed to keeping records can continue doing so with minimal resources. The tools are simple, the environment familiar. The work occupies time without demanding results. In uncertain conditions, this has value. Officials did not gather to declare that salaries had ended. They noticed slowly. Payments arrived late, then irregularly, then not at all. Work continued anyway. Stopping would have raised questions, continuing required none. Habit functioned as a kind of shelter. It allowed individuals to occupy a role without confronting its emptiness directly. Documents accumulated in rooms that grew quieter each year. Shelves held papers no longer referenced daily. Some records described offices that no longer existed. Others detailed obligations that could not be enforced. Still, they were preserved. A clerk, protecting documents, did not believe they guaranteed the future. He protected them because they existed. Existence alone justified care. The act of preservation replaced belief. In earlier centuries, records supported authority. Now they supported routine. They anchored time. They provided structure to days otherwise defined by uncertainty. Filing a document did not restore order. It delayed disorder. This delay mattered. There was no ceremony marking the transition from governance to administration. It happened gradually, through tone rather than decree. Officials adjusted expectations without discussion. Decisions took longer. Responses softened. Silence increased between communications. No one announced the end of authority. Authority simply learned to speak less. Some offices became symbolic without intending to. A man still called magistrate no longer adjudicated disputes with confidence. He listened, he advised. He recorded outcomes when possible. His presence provided familiarity rather than resolution. People continued to approach him because he remained available, not because he held power. This persistence did not imply stability. It implied inertia. The system moved because it had always moved. Stopping required energy that continuation did not. Even ineffective routines can persist when alternatives are unclear. Rome discovered this quietly. There is understated humor in how form outlived function. Titles remained impressive on paper. In practice, they described tasks rather than authority. A clerk's day involved more copying than deciding, more storing than directing. The work narrowed without vanishing. Administrative spaces changed as well. Offices shrank. Fewer people occupied larger rooms. Conversations lowered in volume. The architecture remained formal, but activity did not fill it. The echo of footsteps mattered more than proclamations. Silence became the dominant sound. These officials did not imagine themselves as guardians of decline. They saw themselves as people doing what was expected yesterday, hoping it would still matter tomorrow. The future felt unclear. The past felt heavy. The present demanded routine. Payment, when absent long enough, stops being anticipated. Officials adapted by finding other means of support. Some took secondary work. Some relied on family networks. Some reduced their needs. None of this required official acknowledgement. Survival adjusted quietly around office hours. Records from this period reveal careful phrasing. Language avoids certainty. Commitments are conditional. Dates are noted without confidence. The tone reflects an awareness that writing no longer ensures outcome. Still, writing continues. The habit holds. Authority, in this form, becomes memory enacted daily. It does not compel. It reminds. It signals continuity, even when continuity is thin. This signal reassures some. For others, it simply fills time. Late-night history lingers here because this is endurance without drama. No collapse, no reform, just continuation stripped of reward. Officials without salaries embody a system surviving as routine rather than power. At night, offices close early. Lamps burn briefly. Papers are stacked carefully. Nothing dramatic is resolved. Tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to feel familiar. That familiarity replaces confidence. The city functions partly because these routines persist. They provide predictability in small doses, a place to bring documents, a person to ask, an office that opens even if it decides little. This modest stability matters. There is no triumph here. There is no tragedy. There is maintenance. Authority survives as habit because habit requires less belief than ambition. Rome did not fall into silence. It learned to speak more quietly. In the end, officials without salaries represent a phase rather than a failure. Administration continued because it could. It occupied space left behind by power. It filled days that might otherwise have unraveled. This was not governance as intended. It was governance as remembered. And perhaps that is the most unsettling detail. The system did not end when it stopped working. It ended only when people stopped returning to it. Until then, a clerk sharpened his stylus, opened a ledger, and wrote carefully. Not because the future depended on it, but because the page was blank, and blank pages still asked to be filled. People living among great remains. Ordinary Romans continued their daily lives inside spaces built for an empire that no longer operated. This was not a deliberate choice. It was simply where the walls were. Laundry hung beside stone arches that once framed processions. Children ran across floors originally laid for ceremony. Cooking fires warmed rooms designed for official gatherings. None of this felt like an occupation of ruins. It felt like living. There was no consistent sense of tragedy attached to these surroundings. Tragedy requires contrast, and contrast fades with familiarity. Ruins feel dramatic only when they are new. These were not new. They had already settled into the background of memory. For most people, the structures were not symbols of loss. They were shelter, boundaries, shade, and reliable stone that did not move. Daily life adjusted without comment. People learned which walls blocked wind most effectively, which corners stayed dry during rain, which old stairways were still safe to climb. Knowledge spread quietly through repetition. Someone tried a space. It worked. Others followed. The architecture did not instruct. It allowed. The scale of the buildings did not intimidate those who lived among them. Large spaces shrink when filled with routine. A vast hall becomes manageable once divided by hanging fabric, storage, and firelight. Ceilings remain high, but attention lowers. The human eye adjusts. Grandeur recedes into utility. Children treated statues as obstacles rather than representations. Broken limbs became places to sit. Pedestals became platforms for games. The figures did not command respect or fear. They were familiar shapes, worn smooth by weather and touch. Memory does not survive rough handling. Stone does. Cooking transformed ceremonial rooms into domestic ones. Smoke stained surfaces that once gleamed. The smell of food replaced the echo of formal speech. This was not an act of defiance, it was efficiency. Fire warms, regardless of architectural intention. Heat matters more than meaning. Families did not discuss the past of the spaces they occupied. There was no need. The past did not feed anyone. It did not mend clothing or provide light. What mattered was what the space could still do. The rest faded naturally. There is gentle irony in how effectively imperial architecture supported post-imperial survival. The empire had built for permanence. Permanence proved adaptable. Thick walls moderated temperature. Stone floors endured constant use. Covered areas allowed work to continue regardless of weather. The structures outlived their purpose and found new ones without asking permission. People did not imagine themselves as caretakers of history. They were caretakers of households. The stones did not require protection beyond what daily use provided. Damage occurred, but slowly. Wear replaced collapse. The buildings aged alongside their occupants. Sound changed inside these spaces. Voices softened. Laughter dispersed differently. Fire crackled against surfaces never designed for it. The acoustics adjusted. What once amplified authority now absorbed conversation. The architecture learned a new language without needing to be taught. Markets sometimes appeared inside former civic buildings. Temporary stalls formed under arches. Goods rested against walls that had once displayed announcements. Exchange happened quietly. People moved through with familiarity. No one remarked on the contrast. The contrast had normalized. Sleeping arrangements adapted as well. Large rooms were partitioned informally. Cloth, wood, and habit created boundaries. Privacy became approximate. This did not feel intrusive. It felt shared. Living among remains required tolerance for proximity. There is understated humor in how indestructible ambition became background furniture. What had been designed to impress now supported drying clothes. What had once defined power now defined shade. The transformation did not require critique. It required time. Some spaces were avoided, not out of reverence, but practicality. Unstable ceilings, flooded areas, dark corridors. People learned which parts of the old city were cooperative and which were not. This knowledge replaced maps. Experience replaced planning. The remains did not dictate behavior. They responded to it. Paths formed where people walked most often. Surfaces polished under repeated touch. The city reshaped itself through use rather than intention. This process felt organic rather than historical. Those born into this environment did not perceive decline. They perceived continuity. Their world contained large stones, uneven floors, and reused spaces. This was normal. Stories of former grandeur existed, but they did not dominate imagination. Imagination follows necessity. At night, the remains became quieter, but no more imposing. Firelight softened edges. Shadows simplified forms. The city did not feel haunted. It felt inhabited. Presence matters more than origin. Cracks were patched. Openings adjusted. Small improvements accumulated. The remains were not preserved. They were maintained enough to function. This was sufficient. There was no shared narrative about living among greatness. There was only routine, wake, work, cook, sleep. The stones participated by staying in place. That was their contribution. Late-night history lingers here because this is endurance without commentary. No speeches about adaptation. No lamentation. Life simply continued in the spaces available. The empire had ended. The city had not. The remains did not demand remembrance. They accepted use. This acceptance allowed people to stop thinking historically and start thinking practically. Survival prefers surfaces that do not require interpretation. Over generations, the distinction between monument and home blurred completely. What had once been remarkable became background. The extraordinary became ordinary through repetition. This is how scale dissolves. There is something quietly unsettling about how easily greatness fades into furniture, not through destruction, but through living. The stones remained impressive only to those who paused. Most did not pause, they lived. In the end, people living among great remains did not feel surrounded by history. They felt surrounded by walls, walls that held, floors that endured. spaces that allowed life to continue without instruction. When the night deepened, fires dimmed, and voices settled, the old structures receded further. They did not watch, they did not judge. They stood, and standing proved enough. The empire was gone, the stones remained. People adapted. And in that adaptation, history did not collapse. It thinned, softened, and became part of daily life without asking to be remembered loudly. Homes as the new center. Public life did not disappear in Rome after the fall. It weakened, it thinned, it stopped demanding attention. In response, private life did not rise dramatically. It simply grew denser. Families gathered closer together, not out of sentiment, but out of practicality. Homes became anchors because nothing else reliably held. The inward turn was not emotional, it was logistical. Safety now depended on proximity and familiarity rather than visibility or scale. Rome had once been outward-facing. Streets, forums, baths, and public buildings structured daily movement. After central coordination faltered, these spaces lost instruction. They remained available but no longer necessary. Life adjusted by retreating inward. The home absorbed functions that public spaces could no longer guarantee. Cooking, storage, repair, and even small exchanges shifted behind walls. This shift did not feel like withdrawal, it felt like compression. Activities that had once been dispersed across the city folded inward. A single room might serve multiple purposes depending on the hour. Sleeping, eating, working, and storing. Overlapped without ceremony. Boundaries softened. Efficiency replaced distinction. Homes did not expand to meet this demand. They intensified. More people shared fewer rooms. Generations overlapped. Privacy became approximate rather than expected. This was not treated as loss. It was treated as adjustment. Familiarity compensated for crowding. Knowing who shared the space mattered more than how much space existed. The architecture responded quietly. Doorways were reinforced, windows narrowed, interiors grew darker but warmer. Firelight replaced daylight for longer hours. The home became a contained environment where variables could be managed. Wind, noise, and strangers were filtered out. Control, once exercised publicly, became domestic. There is mild irony in how quickly importance relocated. Rome had invested heavily in public identity. After the fall, survival depended on domestic reliability. The smallest unit became the most resilient, not because it was ideal, but because it was manageable. One household could adapt faster than an entire city. Homes also became centers of knowledge. Practical skills circulated within families rather than institutions. Repair techniques, food preservation, and informal medicine passed through observation. Learning happened through repetition rather than instruction. Children absorbed routines without explanation. This knowledge was not written. It did not need to be. Social bonds tightened accordingly. Trust narrowed. The circle of reliability shrank. This contraction reduced risk. Fewer unknowns meant fewer surprises. The world became smaller but more predictable. Predictability replaced ambition as the dominant value. Even conflict adjusted its scale. Disputes were handled within familiar groups when possible. External authority was unreliable. Internal negotiation became preferable. Compromise mattered more than enforcement. The home provided space for resolution without escalation. Marble floors mattered less than warmth. Decorative columns mattered less than sturdy walls. A home did not need to impress. It needed to hold, and holding proved easier than performing. Daily rhythms reorganized around domestic space. Mornings began quietly. Tasks were distributed informally. Work occurred close to where people slept. Movement decreased. Energy was conserved. Distance became an expense rather than an opportunity. This inward focus altered perception of time. Days felt shorter, seasons felt closer. The outside world receded without vanishing entirely. News arrived slowly and irregularly. Its impact diminished by the time it arrived. Immediate concerns took precedence. Homes also absorbed spiritual and communal functions without formal structure. Gatherings happened privately. Shared meals replaced public rituals, meaning condensed into routine. This did not feel deficient. It felt sufficient. The city did not empty. It rearranged. Streets became connectors rather than destinations. Public spaces became transitional rather than central. The home replaced the forum as the primary point of orientation. At night, this change was most apparent. Fires burned low. Doors closed early. Sound diminished quickly. The city grew quiet from the inside outward. This quiet was not imposed. It emerged naturally when movement slowed. There is something quietly unsettling about how effective this shift was. Rome had been built to operate outwardly. When that failed, it learned to function inwardly without debate. Adaptation did not require consensus. It required repetition. The home became the place where continuity survived. Not tradition in the grand sense, but habit. Habit carried memory forward without commentary. Life did not pause to evaluate the change. It continued. Children born into this pattern accepted it as normal. The empire existed as stories, not structure. What they knew was proximity, shared space, familiar faces. This world felt complete enough. Over time, the distinction between public and private blurred further. Some homes hosted small exchanges. Some stored goods for others. Domestic space expanded its function incrementally. The home did not remain isolated. It became flexible. Late-night history lingers here because this is where survival becomes quiet. No rebuilding campaigns, no declarations of renewal, just families arranging themselves closer together, reducing exposure and continuing. Rome did not collapse into isolation. It condensed, and in condensing, it preserved enough stability to endure. Homes did not replace the city. They allowed it to persist in a reduced form. When the night deepened, the home held what remained. Heat, people, routine. Outside, the monuments waited. Inside, life continued. Public life weakened. Private life strengthened. This was not a moral choice. It was an efficient one. And efficiency, in uncertain times, often proves more durable than ideals. The inward turn did not announce itself. It did not ask permission. It happened because it worked. Rome learned to contain itself, room by room, family by family, until containment became the new center. And in that center, quiet endurance replaced visibility, familiarity replaced authority, and the simple act of staying close proved enough to carry life forward without needing to explain why. Work without future promise. Work continued in Rome after the fall, but it changed its meaning. Labor no longer pointed forward. It did not suggest progress, advancement, or improvement beyond the present day. People worked because work fed them today. It warmed them tonight. It repaired what had broken this week. Tomorrow existed, but It did not promise reward. It only repeated necessity. This shift did not require announcement. It was felt through absence. Wages did not increase. Positions did not open. Recognition thinned. What remained was effort directed toward immediate survival. Work lost its narrative. It became practical again, stripped of expectation. The future stopped serving as motivation. The present became sufficient. Crafts survived where they answered direct needs. Repair mattered. Preservation mattered. Skills that extended the life of objects gained value quietly. Knowing how to mend a tool outweighed knowing how to display one. Usefulness replaced prestige without debate. No one needed convincing. Hunger and wear made the argument clearly. Ambition softened, not because people abandoned desire, but because desire learned restraint. Wanting more became expensive. Expecting improvement invited disappointment. The city adjusted by lowering its horizon. This was not resignation, it was calibration. Energy conserved by reducing projection proved more reliable than hope stretched too far. Workshops remained open, but they felt smaller. Fewer hands, fewer orders. The pace slowed. A craftsperson focused on quality rather than output. There was no advantage to speed if replacement materials were uncertain. Durability became the measure of success. A repaired object that lasted mattered more than a new one that failed quickly. There is mild irony in how this environment rewarded competence over ambition. Rome had once celebrated achievement loudly. After the fall, the quiet worker endured. Skill did not seek attention. It circulated through word of mouth. People remembered who could fix, who could make, who could keep things functioning. Reputation shrank to usefulness. Work no longer promised mobility. A person did not expect to rise through labor. They expected to remain stable if possible. Stability itself became an achievement. The absence of collapse counted as success. This recalibration reduced anxiety. When expectation narrows, disappointment loses power. Payment adjusted accordingly. Compensation arrived inconsistently, sometimes in coin, sometimes in goods, sometimes in favors remembered rather than recorded. This flexibility kept exchange alive. Formal contracts mattered less than trust, reinforced through repetition. People worked for those they knew would return. Training also changed. Apprenticeship lost its future orientation. Learning focused on immediate tasks rather than long-term mastery. Knowledge transferred through proximity. Children learned by watching. There was less emphasis on innovation. Refinement replaced invention. Familiar methods were safer than experimental ones. There is understated humor in how little rhetoric survived in work. No one spoke about purpose. No one framed labor as calling. It was simply done. Work occupied time and produced results. That was enough. Meaning did not need to be extracted. It existed in outcome. Markets reflected this shift. Goods appeared irregularly. Variety narrowed. Demand followed availability rather than desire. Crafts adapted by simplifying offerings. Fewer options reduced waste. This was not minimalism by ideology. It was minimalism by constraint. Workspaces themselves became quieter. Fewer tools, fewer visitors. Sound diminished. The rhythm of labor slowed. This did not feel empty, it felt measured. Excess movement wastes energy. Stillness conserves it. The absence of future promise altered social comparison. Without ladders to climb, status flattened. People distinguished themselves through reliability rather than aspiration. Being dependable mattered more than being impressive. This shift did not erase inequality, but it changed how it was expressed. Some crafts faded entirely. Skills that depended on luxury lost relevance. Others persisted stubbornly. Blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers. Those who could maintain essentials remained necessary. Necessity protected them more effectively than patronage ever had. Workdays shortened when possible, not out of leisure, but efficiency. Overwork without return made little sense. Energy saved could be used elsewhere. People learned to stop earlier. Night arrived sooner. There is something quietly unsettling about how smoothly this transition occurred. The loss of future promise did not paralyze the city. It clarified priorities. When tomorrow stops offering reward, today becomes clearer. Work became cyclical rather than progressive. Tasks repeated. Seasons returned. Skills applied again and again. Improvement occurred incrementally but without expectation. This reduced pressure. Pressure had become costly. At night, tools were put away carefully, not because they were valuable symbols, but because they were needed again. Maintenance replaced accumulation. Owning less meant caring more. People did not imagine themselves as living in decline. They imagined themselves as living. The absence of promise did not feel like failure. It felt like reality acknowledged. Late-night history lingers here because this is endurance, stripped of illusion. Labor without narrative. Effort without applause. Work done because it must be done. The city did not stop functioning when ambition softened. It adjusted, skills redistributed, expectations lowered. Life continued at a quieter volume. Work without future promise proved sustainable in ways grand plans had not. It did not demand belief. It required presence. And presence, applied consistently, kept Rome moving forward even when forward no longer meant progress. When the night deepened and workshops closed, there was no anticipation of advancement waiting in the morning. There was only the certainty that work would return because need would return. This certainty was enough. In the end, labor became honest again. It fed, it repaired, it preserved. It did not promise more than it could deliver. And in that restraint, it allowed life to continue without needing to explain itself or pretend that tomorrow would be better than today. Time measured by daylight and fatigue. Time in Rome did not disappear after the fall. It changed texture. It lost its forward tension and settled into shorter, quieter units that required less explanation. Morning arrived because light arrived. Afternoon passed because the body continued moving. Evening appeared when movement slowed. Sleep came not by schedule, but by insistence. Fatigue replaced clocks. Daylight replaced planning. Time no longer invited ambition. It requested attention. This adjustment was not philosophical. No one gathered to discuss a new relationship with time. The change emerged through habit. Bells rang less frequently. Appointments loosened. Deadlines faded into suggestion. What remained was the body's negotiation with light, hunger, and tiredness. Time folded inward, becoming something felt rather than measured. Morning began when visibility returned. Work started when it could be seen clearly. There was no advantage to beginning earlier. Darkness did not reward effort. It hid mistakes. So people waited. Waiting did not feel like delay. It felt appropriate. The day unfolded at a pace set by the sun, not by expectation. Afternoons stretched unevenly. Some days felt long. Others passed quickly. The difference depended on labor, weather, and mood. Without schedules to enforce uniformity, time regained irregularity. This irregularity reduced pressure. When nothing demanded consistency, variation became acceptable. Evening arrived gently. The light softened. Activity slowed. There was no need to announce closure. It occurred naturally. People recognized the moment when effort became inefficient. Continuing would cost more energy than it returned. Stopping made sense. Sleep followed exhaustion rather than instruction. People slept when tired. They woke when rested or when light returned. This alignment reduced anxiety. Anxiety depends on anticipation. Anticipation depends on projection. Rome had stopped projecting. Planning narrowed accordingly. People planned for the day ahead, occasionally for the week, rarely beyond that. The future existed, but it did not dominate attention. Thinking too far ahead required confidence, instability. Stability was limited. Attention adjusted. This narrowing did not feel like loss. It felt like relief. Long plans invite disappointment when conditions shift. Short plans adapt easily. Rome learned this without naming it. Flexibility replaced certainty. There is quiet irony in how this temporal contraction improved resilience. The empire had once depended on long timelines. Roads, taxes, campaigns, construction projects measured in decades. After the fall, time measured in daylight and fatigue proved more durable. Without clocks enforcing uniformity, people trusted internal signals: hunger, tiredness, heat, cold. These signals regulated activity more effectively than abstract hours. The body became the instrument of timekeeping. It rarely lied. Work adjusted naturally. Tasks suited to morning were done early. Heavier labor waited until light strengthened. Fine work paused when shadows interfered. Efficiency increased because effort matched condition. Social interaction followed the same rhythm. Visits occurred when people were awake and available. Conversation ended when fatigue appeared. There was no offense taken. Tiredness required no apology. Everyone recognized it. Markets opened and closed irregularly. Sellers arrived when goods were ready. Buyers came when need arose. Predictability became local. People learned patterns through observation rather than announcement. Knowledge spread quietly. This temporal looseness altered memory. Without rigid schedules, days blended. Distinctions softened. Events were remembered by circumstance rather than date. The day it rained heavily, the week when grain was scarce, the evening when the fire burned late. Time lost its sharp edges. This softness made endurance easier. Sharp time cuts attention. Soft time absorbs it. Night held particular weight. Darkness reduced activity to essentials. Movement slowed. Sound carried differently. People listened more. The absence of light enforced stillness. Stillness conserved energy. In this environment, urgency became rare. Urgency requires belief that delay causes loss. When loss is constant, urgency loses meaning. Rome adjusted by accepting gradualness. There is understated humor in how modern life obsesses over saving time while ancient Rome learned to spend it carefully. Saving time assumes it can be stored. Spending time acknowledges it passes regardless. Fatigue became a respected signal. Ignoring it risked injury. People learned limits quickly. Limits preserved continuity. The relationship between age and time also shifted. Older people were not expected to keep pace with younger ones. Pace adjusted individually. Comparison lost relevance. Endurance mattered more than speed. Seasonal rhythms regained importance. Winter shortened days. Summer extended them. Activity followed. Artificial extension of time through light was limited. Darkness remained authoritative. This acceptance of natural rhythm reduced conflict. People did not fight the day. They followed it. Resistance wastes energy. Without long-term projection, fear softened. Fear often imagines futures worse than the present. When imagination shortens, fear loses reach. Time measured by daylight and fatigue did not eliminate hardship. It organized it. Hardship became manageable when contained within the day. Late-night history lingers here because this relationship with time feels unfamiliar. Modern life stretches attention across weeks, months, years. Rome, after the fall, contracted attention back into the body. The body does not plan far ahead. It responds. This responsiveness proved sufficient. There is something quietly unsettling in how adaptable humans are. Remove clocks. Remove schedules. Life continues. Time became something lived rather than chased. This shift did not solve problems, it made them bearable. When night settled fully, there was no pressure to remain awake, no productivity to maintain. Sleep arrived naturally. Rest restored capacity for the next day. Morning returned, light returned, work returned. Not because the future demanded it, but because the present required it. This cycle repeated. Days stacked gently rather than aggressively. Time moved sideways rather than forward. Rome did not lose time. It changed how time was held. Measured by daylight and fatigue, life continued without promise, without projection, and without collapse. The city learned to exist inside the day rather than ahead of it. In that adjustment, anxiety thinned. Expectation softened. Attention narrowed. Endurance increased. Time stopped pointing forward confidently. It pointed inward, toward the body, toward the present moment. And that quietly was enough. A city quieter but not empty. Rome did not become silent after the fall. Silence suggests absence, and Rome was never absent. What changed was volume. The city lowered its voice deliberately, not out of fear, but out of adjustment. Crowds thinned without vanishing. Announcements faded without being formally withdrawn. Public noise receded, replaced by smaller sounds of domestic life continuing inside walls that had once amplified civic confidence. This quiet was not panic. It was efficiency. Noise had stopped producing benefit, and Rome stopped spending energy on it. The streets still carried sound, but sound without ambition. Footsteps replaced speeches. Doors replaced decrees. The scrape of sandals on stone mattered more than proclamations. Rome had learned that sound attracts attention, and attention no longer guaranteed protection or order. Lowering volume was not surrender, it was calibration. A city accustomed to projecting authority discovered that restraint preserved stability better than assertion ever had. Public spaces adjusted first. Forums no longer hosted voices competing for dominance. Instead, they absorbed movement without pause or ceremony. Basilicas echoed with emptiness that felt intentional rather than abandoned. Architecture stopped demanding participation. Buildings allowed life to move around them without instruction. The absence of organized sound let structures recede into background function. Stone held space quietly without asking to be interpreted. Domestic sound became the dominant layer of the city. Cooking, breathing, soft conversation, the shifting of bodies at rest. These sounds did not travel far. They did not invite response. They existed only to serve those inside rooms rather than those passing through. Rome's soundscape narrowed, and in narrowing, it stabilized. Life adjusted its volume to match its reduced expectations. There is subtle irony in how peaceful this quieter Rome appears from a distance. A city with lower volume often looks calm to observers who mistake silence for safety. In reality, Rome was not safer. It was simply less performative. Performance requires belief in an audience. Rome no longer trusted that an audience existed, so it stopped projecting itself outward. Markets reflected this adjustment clearly. They did not disappear. They whispered. Transactions occurred without spectacle. Sellers spoke softly. Buyers lingered briefly and moved on. No one announced prices loudly. Negotiation became minimal. Goods passed hand to hand efficiently without ceremony. Commerce adapted to quiet because quiet reduced risk and preserved continuity. Officials adjusted their voices as well. Orders softened into suggestions. Instructions were delivered privately rather than proclaimed publicly. Authority did not vanish, but it learned to operate without amplification. A quieter authority attracts less resistance. Rome discovered this not through theory, but through lived necessity and exhaustion. Night deepened this transformation. Lamps were lit sparingly, fires were kept low, sound thinned further as fatigue replaced vigilance. The city learned that noise extends effort without return. Silence allowed rest. Rest preserved function. Function mattered more than expression now. Children adapted quickly. They learned to play indoors or close to home. Games softened. Shouts became gestures. Adults did not instruct this shift explicitly. Children sensed it. Cities teach behavior through atmosphere more than command. Rome's atmosphere had lowered its voice, and its youngest residents followed. Animals responded honestly. Dogs barked less. Horses shifted quietly. Birds settled earlier. Noise unsettles animals first. Reduced noise calmed them, which in turn reduced human anxiety. Calm reinforced itself when not interrupted. There is gentle humor in how history often equates quiet with decay. Rome demonstrates the opposite. Noise belongs to ambition, quiet belongs to maintenance. After the fall, Rome entered a maintenance phase. Maintenance does not require announcements. It requires repetition. Work continued without fanfare. Craftspeople labored without advertising skill. Repairs were made without acknowledgement. Tools were used until they failed quietly. This uncelebrated labor kept the city functional longer than any speech ever could. Sound became selective rather than absent. Certain noises still mattered. Cries for help still traveled. Warnings still cut through quiet when necessary. Silence was not total. It was managed. Rome preserved the ability to be heard by speaking less often. Public rituals faded not because belief vanished, but because coordination became costly. Coordinated noise requires trust. Trust had thinned. Individual practice replaced collective expression, meaning localized without disappearing. Architecture absorbed this change patiently. Large spaces no longer demanded occupancy. Smaller rooms felt sufficient. Sound fit spaces better when ambition shrank. The city adjusted psychologically before it adjusted structurally. Conflict also became quieter. Disputes were handled privately. Violence, when it occurred, did not escalate into spectacle. Spectacle attracts intervention. Intervention no longer promised resolution. Quiet conflict dissipated faster. Late-night history rests comfortably here. A city that lowers its volume reveals how survival often sounds. Not heroic, not tragic, just steady, breath by breath, step by step. Rome did not mourn its lost noise. Noise had been expensive. Silence was affordable. In a world where resources thinned, affordability mattered. Time passed differently in this quieter Rome. Without constant interruption, hours stretched gently. Days felt less rushed. Urgency had been a luxury of empire. The city learned to live without it. There is understated relief in this. A city no longer required to speak loudly can listen. Rome listened to itself. It learned where effort still produced return and where silence preserved energy. People stopped announcing intention. They acted. Action without announcement attracts less scrutiny. Less scrutiny allows continuity. Continuity became Rome's primary achievement. The quieter Rome was not empty. It was occupied by adjusted life. Life that fit smaller expectations. Life that did not demand attention to validate itself. When sound diminished, thought softened. Without constant noise, fear lost amplification. Anxiety thrives in loud spaces. Quiet diffused it. Rome's streets carried this lesson forward. Stone remembered footsteps, not voices. Footsteps endure. Voices fade. The city did not regret becoming quieter. Regret requires comparison. Rome had stopped comparing itself to what it had been. Comparison exhausts. Acceptance sustains. Late-night history notices how rarely civilizations choose quiet voluntarily. Rome did not choose it. Circumstance imposed it. Rome accepted it. That acceptance mattered. A quieter Rome lasted longer than a louder one would have. Loud cities provoke reaction. Quiet cities adapt. This was not invisibility. It was discretion. Rome remained visible enough to function, quiet enough to avoid drawing destructive attention. The city did not empty. It recalibrated sound to match reality. Reality no longer rewarded volume. By lowering its voice, Rome preserved its breath. Breath keeps a city alive when speeches fail. A city quieter but not empty is a city learning how to survive without performance. Rome learned that lesson slowly, quietly, and effectively. Survival without declaration. Adjustment did not arrive with banners or slogans. It spread quietly like habit relearning itself after shock. Streets were used differently. Spaces were occupied with less expectation. Roles softened. The city remained not because it defended its former identity, but because it stopped insisting that identity still applied. Rome did not replace its story. It simply stopped telling one loudly. Survival unfolded without declaration because declaration requires confidence, and confidence had become unreliable. Rome learned that certainty was expensive and fragile. Systems that depended on belief collapsed faster than those that depended on repetition. Adjustment favored repetition. People repeated what still worked and quietly abandoned what did not. No one explained this process because explanation was unnecessary. The city did not need to understand itself to continue functioning. It needed only to remain responsive to immediate conditions. The absence of a new narrative unsettled later observers more than the collapse itself. Histories prefer announcements. They search for beginnings and endings, for moments when identity is replaced cleanly. Rome offered neither. It drifted into a different form by subtracting rather than inventing. Subtraction rarely attracts attention. It removes pressure instead of creating direction. Rome subtracted ambition, projection, and scale. What remained was smaller, slower, and easier to sustain. Daily life reflected this shift everywhere. People stopped acting as representatives of empire and began acting as residents of neighborhoods. The distinction mattered. Empire demands performance. Neighborhoods demand cooperation. Cooperation consumes less energy than performance. Rome conserved energy by becoming local again. This localization was not celebrated. It simply happened because it solved problems more efficiently than imperial thinking ever could under weakened conditions. Authority adjusted in similar fashion. Power that once announced itself learned to speak quietly or not at all. Enforcement became selective. Rules softened. Compliance emerged from familiarity rather than fear. This was not chaos, it was recalibration. A city no longer capable of imposing uniformity learned to tolerate variation. Variation reduced friction. Reduced friction prevented collapse. Rome survived by allowing itself to become uneven. Infrastructure adapted without ideology. Roads were maintained where they were still useful. Others deteriorated slowly without protest. Buildings changed function without permission. Grandeur aged into utility. Utility does not require explanation. It justifies itself through use. Rome learned that survival favored things that could be repurposed easily rather than defended symbolically. There is quiet irony in how unheroic this survival appears. No last stand, no rallying cry, no restoration movement. Rome endured by becoming less interesting to itself. Interest creates demand. Demand creates strain. Strain breaks systems. Rome released demand and discovered that systems held longer when left alone. This restraint looks passive only to those who confuse noise with action. The city's social fabric adjusted as well. Status mattered less when status could not guarantee protection. Skill gained value. Reliability replaced prestige. People trusted those who solved problems quietly rather than those who spoke confidently. This shift did not overturn hierarchy completely, but it diluted it enough to reduce tension. Dilution is a survival strategy rarely acknowledged because it lacks drama. Memory changed shape during this period. The past remained present but stopped instructing behavior. Rome remembered empire without expecting it to return. This distinction mattered. Expectation creates disappointment. Memory without expectation becomes reference rather than burden. Rome carried its history lightly by refusing to demand anything from it. Children growing up in this adjusted Rome did not experience loss. They experienced normality. Their baseline was modest function rather than imperial promise. This generational recalibration anchored survival more effectively than policy ever could. Identity shifted not through decree, but through lived routine repeated until it felt natural. Economically, Rome simplified. Trade narrowed. Exchange localized. Luxury receded. Essentials remained. This was not immediate poverty. It was cautious sustainability. Systems that promise abundance collapse when abundance becomes unreliable. Systems that promise sufficiency adapt more easily. Rome chose sufficiency by default rather than design. The city also learned to tolerate ambiguity. Not knowing who ruled decisively mattered less than knowing whom to cooperate with locally. Clarity was replaced by familiarity. Familiarity reduces anxiety more effectively than certainty when certainty cannot be trusted. Rome lowered its demand for explanation, and in doing so, reduced psychological strain. There is gentle humor in how survival without declaration frustrates narrative. Historians want moments. Rome offered duration. Duration resists compression. It stretches quietly across time, refusing to be summarized. This resistance is precisely what made survival possible. Rome did not provide a story. It provided continuity. Late-night history rests comfortably here because nothing insists on meaning. Survival does not argue. It repeats. Rome repeated itself into a different form without announcing the change. The city remained because it allowed itself to become sufficient rather than significant. Rome survived without declaration because declaration would have required agreement about what was ending and what was beginning. Agreement was unavailable. Adjustment required no consensus. Individuals adjusted independently. Over time, these adjustments aligned enough to sustain collective life. This alignment was loose, imperfect, and uneven. That imperfection was an advantage. Perfect systems shatter under pressure. Imperfect systems bend. Rome bent. Bending preserved structure long after rigidity would have failed. By refusing to define itself again too quickly, Rome avoided the trap of false renewal. Renewal implies restoration. Restoration implies disappointment. Rome chose endurance instead. Endurance asks less and delivers more quietly. Survival without declaration did not restore Rome. It preserved it long enough for transformation to continue gradually. This transformation did not aim for greatness. It aimed for stability. Stability does not inspire applause. It allows sleep. Rome slept better once it stopped insisting on being something specific. Letting go reduced vigilance. Reduced vigilance conserved energy. Conserved energy sustained life. Empires demand belief. Cities require function. Rome released belief before function failed. That sequence mattered. Survival arrived not through resistance, but through accommodation. Rome remained because it adjusted, until adjustment felt like nothing at all. No declaration marked this success. None was needed. The city continued. And continuation, without promise and without performance, proved to be enough. Daily life outlasted empire. Rome did not conclude with fire or ceremony. It concluded with repetition, with people continuing to live inside systems that no longer promised coherence but still offered shelter. Daily life outlasted empire because daily life does not require belief. It requires food, light, rest, and habits learned deeply enough to survive disappointment. Markets reopened in smaller forms without announcement. Officials continued working without pay because stopping would have required explanation. Families slept beneath arches that once symbolized eternity, not as symbols themselves, but as convenient protection from weather and darkness. The empire receded quietly, not as an event, but as a condition that slowly lost relevance. Late-night history notices how little of this needed interpretation. People adjusted without speeches. They repaired what could be repaired and ignored what could not. Routine replaced ideology. Habit replaced authority. This was not resilience as celebration. It was endurance as maintenance, practiced without pride. There is gentle irony in how forgettable this ending feels. Histories prefer collapse that arrives with smoke and noise. Rome offered something less cooperative. It dimmed. It reduced itself. It learned to exist without expectation, without projection, without the need to explain what it had been. Daily life continued because continuation was simpler than conclusion. At night, this feels especially honest. Lamps burned low, doors closed, breathing slowed. The city did not argue with its condition. It accepted that lasting does not require meaning, only repetition. Rome did not disappear. It rested inside routine, and routine carried it forward quietly, long after empire stopped asking to be remembered. History rarely records this kind of ending because it offers no lesson, no warning, and no spectacle, only the quiet evidence that ordinary days, repeated carefully, can outlast power, ambition, certainty, and even memory itself. When systems fail without apology, quietly,